Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, Excellencies, Ambassadors, representative of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guest, Mr. Simon Cree, Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany in Hanoi. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a great honor for the DAV to warmly welcome you to the Mekong Forum, the second meeting of the forum so far.
Recording in progress.
It's a great pleasure for the DAV to continue to receive your support and to receive your full participation to our events. Throughout the years, the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam have been trying to provide forums to discuss topics of interest of Vietnam, of the region, and of the broader community. And your presence and support has been fundamental in the success of those events, including the Mekong Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, the Mekong matters a lot to Vietnam. And because of that, we thought that the Mekong also matter to Southeast Asia, matter to ASEAN, it matters to the Indo-Pacific, and maybe have some relevance to the broader international community as well. And therefore, we created this Mekong Forum to discuss and tackle that issue. For some time, we have been asked whether the Mekong is an ASEAN matter. There was some views that the Mekong only pertains to a sub-region, and it's not appropriate to have it addressed in an ASEAN agenda. Just like the South China Sea issue, for a time, it was considered to be a matter pertaining to only the claimant states within the ASEAN. But as the issue evolves, now ASEAN have taken full charge of the South China Sea issue, understanding that the South China Sea issue has relevance and consequences beyond the claimant states and matters to the region as a whole. And now we are looking at the Mekong in a similar manner. We thought that the Mekong issue is or have relevance beyond the Mekong sub-region. It matters because it's relevant to ASEAN connectivity, ASEAN unity. It's related to ASEAN partners. And peace and stability in the Mekong sub-region have the potential to affect peace and stability of the whole of Southeast Asia as a region. Therefore, we are discussing ASEAN Centrality on the Mekong issue today. And to discuss that issue, we couldn't find a better speaker than Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan. I leave the introduction to Ambassador Bilahari to his good friend who is sitting next to him, Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh. But we are also delighted to have Dr. Lê Thu Hương, who is a regional security expert who is joining us online today. Welcome to you, Dr. Lê Thu Hương. So without any further ado, I'd like to once again thank our co-sponsor, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and also the Embassy of Germany in Hanoi, who made this event possible. I'd like to thank our keynote speakers and commentators, and I'd like to thank all of you for your participation. So I'd like to hand over now to Mr. Simon Cree, our co-sponsor of the event today, to have an opening remarks. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen Hung Son, for your very kind words. I should add that we, as the Embassy, we are not the co-sponsors of this event. This would be the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, so I don't want to take the credit for this. Dear Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam, dear Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore, dear Dr. Lê Thu Hương, Principal Policy Fellow at the Perth US Asia Center, and dear Ms. Vu Thi Tu Phuong, Program Manager at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Vietnam, and dear CAS team, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It is not only a great honor, but also a special pleasure to address you at this opening session of the second Mekong Forum today, that is being jointly organized by the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. And let me add that it is the very first time for me to be here, as I've only arrived to Vietnam a few weeks ago, and I'm already impressed by the professionalism of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, and obviously also by this very nice room here that we are benefiting from. The Konrad-Adenauer Foundation has a long-lasting partnership with DAV, and DAV is now considered the biggest and most important partner of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Vietnam in the areas of foreign and security affairs. Each year, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung has been collaborating with DAV in organizing a number of flagship events, including the China Talks, the Ocean Dialogues, the South China Sea Conference, and the Mekong Forum itself. The Mekong Forum series only started this year, 2022, and today is its second meeting. Together with the South China Sea Conference, the Mekong Forum addresses the top two issues of Vietnamese security policy: the role and importance of Mekong Sub-region cooperation is increasingly strengthened in Vietnam's foreign policy agenda. We took notice that the 13th Party Congress decided to elevate Vietnam's multilateral diplomacy, placing a strong emphasis on a cooperative framework in the Asia-Pacific region, in which the greater Mekong sub-region is determined to be a priority in the implementation of multilateral foreign affairs. Over the years, the situation in the Mekong sub-region has evolved with complexity, causing significant impacts on Vietnam's national security and development. There are four main trends in the region that you are all aware of: the securitization of cooperation, internationalization of cooperation, geopolitical competition among powers, and intra-region challenges such as health and water security. In this context, all riparian states need to determine the benefits, objectives, and measures in participating in sub-region cooperation to propose and integrate cooperative agendas that are the most beneficial to them. This sub-region cooperation is characterized by a plethora of existing and overlapping regional mechanisms and actors. I think it's the complete number is 15, if I'm not completely mistaken. Germany holds that more synergies, integration, and efficiency in their cooperation are therefore urgently needed. I am very eager to hear from the experts today how coherence can be strengthened, and especially which role ASEAN can play in this context. The EU, and especially also Germany, stand ready to play a supportive and balancing role between major powers in the region, particularly in terms of governance, transparency, and standard setting. In this sense, Germany, through its official development assistance, has supported the most important of these organizations, the Mekong River Commission, both financially and by ways of consultancy work, to an amount of 67 million euros since its creation in 1995. Thereby, German cooperation has contributed to the development of water power, enabling both poverty reduction and protection of the environment, to the protection of less advantaged populations against the negative impacts of climate change, as well as to the institutional strengthening of the MRC itself and to capacity building in the neighboring countries. As outlined in our German Indo-Pacific guidelines, Germany will support the implementation of the MRC Strategic Plan 2021 to 25 and provide funding of close to $4 million for this purpose. Finally, I understand that DAV and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, as long-standing partners, are preparing for the Mekong Forum to become a usual entry in the annual calendar of regional security policy experts and to even extend it to other places in Vietnam. So I would like to take this opportunity to express the German Embassy's full support to these plans. And I would, of course, like to wish you and all of us a fruitful exchange this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to the conference today on ASEAN Centrality in addressing the challenges in the Mekong sub-regions. Thank you very much, and xin cảm ơn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon Craney, Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany in Hanoi. So let us now move on to the first session, the keynote session of today's forum. And this session is going to be moderated by Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam, but we prefer the title of the former ASEAN SOM leader because that's more relevant to our topic today. So, Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, you have the floor.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much for the opening remarks from the DAV and from the German Embassy. It's great to have Bilari over here with us in person. After how many years? 2 years? 3 years?
The last time I came to Hanoi? 5 or 6 years.
How do you have another meeting here in the DAV?
Yeah, but that was 5 years or 6 years ago.
Already 5 years. So, very great to have you here. Actually, this forum is the second forum on the Mekong, and you see the title of it, ASEAN Centrality, in addressing the challenges in the Mekong Sub-region. It's great that our forum will be focusing on why the Mekong is so much important, not only for the sub-region itself, but also for ASEAN and for the wider region in the Indo-Pacific, and how ASEAN will be expected to play a role in this sub-region for the wider region, certainly. And certainly, there will be partnership between ASEAN and the dialogue partners on working together for addressing these challenges. So this section will be for the keynote speech, and we have the honor to introduce to you Ambassador Bilari Kosikan. He's now the chairman of the Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. He used to be the permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry of Singapore. He used to be ambassador to Moscow and also to New York at the UN. I met Bilari Kosikan back in 1996 when we worked together in New York at the UN. And later on, we met again when he was permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry of Singapore, playing the role also as ASEAN SOM leader. We had a lot of work together, had a lot of drinks, had a lot of chats, and continue to be until this day. Bilari Kosikan has been known for his frank and straightforward analysis of issues before us, but he has a heart for this region, the ASEAN and also Southeast Asia. He has been here in Vietnam back in the 1990s, starting the first years of our relationship at that point in time. So if you read newspapers, especially Asian newspapers, you will see him from time to time, and today also on the occasion of the funeral for Abe, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Japan. So Bilari will share his thoughts on how important the Mekong sub-region will be and what ASEAN need to do and what we will continue to cooperate with each other. I have the honor to introduce to you Ambassador Bilari Kosikan. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the DAV. Thanks, Vin, for that very kind introduction. Now, I'm going to talk about ASEAN Centrality in general and how the Mekong fits into this or does not fit into this. But before I do that, I thought I should perhaps very, very briefly, in broad strokes, frame the context of ASEAN Centrality, the kind of challenges ASEAN will face. Let me begin with a very general observation. I think anybody in this room or listening to this who is, say, 45 years old or younger, grew up and had your most formative experiences, I mean your education, your first job and so on, at a very abnormal period of world history. That was a very abnormal period between, say, 1989 or thereabouts when the Berlin Wall came down, and about 2008 when the global financial crisis caused widespread disillusionment with American-led globalization, including in America itself. Right? That was a very abnormal period, and because the overwhelming dominance of the United States during that period muted great power competition, and to some even seem to have ended it. Some people were even foolish enough to talk about the end of history, which is a really silly idea in the first place. Well, we are now back, obviously, to a more normal, historically normal period of history, where great power competition is the norm. In fact, it never went away. Right? It was muted, it was de-emphasized, but it was always there. And that kind of competition is inherent in any inherent part of international relations. Now, I don't want to go into much detail, but I think, for example, the war in Ukraine is going to be a long war. Right? It's quite clear that Mr. Putin miscalculated in the most spectacular way possible. But let's not go into that. But I think it's going to be a long war that will end inconclusively. I don't see the Ukrainians being able to push the Russians out of Crimea, out of Donbass, maybe not even Mariupol. Right? On the other hand, I don't see the Russians, even if they mobilize, being able to push, to overrun Ukraine. But at the same time, politically, I don't think any Ukrainian leader can accept a formal settlement that gives away 1/5 of his country. And I don't think Mr. Putin can accept a formal settlement that, in effect, leaves him where he began in February. In February, he more or less controlled Crimea, he more or less controlled the Donbass, right? And now he's just got a little bit extra. That cannot be portrayed in any way as a politically satisfying outcome for him. So I think the most likely outcome in Ukraine will be a frozen conflict, by which I don't mean those little wars in Georgia or in the Caucasus. I mean Korea. The Korean War is a frozen conflict. I don't think there is any prospect of a lasting diplomatic settlement. The best you can hope for in Ukraine is an armistice, and a divided Ukraine that will not be recognized by most of the world. Right? What does that mean? It means all the uncertainties that the Ukraine war has caused will continue over the long run. Look, I think it was very necessary to impose sanctions on Russia because as a sign of disapproval of some really egregious behavior. But I think we all probably underestimated the impact of sanctions on Russia on the world economy that was already reeling from the effects of the pandemic and the restrictions and the kind of tensions between the US and China. So I think this is something that goes beyond the immediate energy shortages in Europe, the immediate rise in food prices. I think this is a long-term thing. But as far as dangerous as the Ukraine war is concerned, it is actually a second-order issue. The first-order issue is US-China competition. And I think the Americans have made very clear they are going to use Ukraine to weaken Russia. And they're going to weaken Russia, this they didn't say, as a signal to China. Because the Ukraine war has placed China in an extremely awkward position. And I don't see any respite. Look, when I read the 4th February statement between Xi Jinping and Putin, and read about this thing about a no-limits partnership with no forbidden areas, I thought this was utter nonsense. Right? There is no professional diplomat in any country that could have agreed to this kind of language. I know Wang Yi, he was our counterpart as SOM leader for ASEAN in China. And I know Lavrov because he was my counterpart in the UN. And whatever I may think of their policies, and I don't think very much about their policies, as professional diplomats, they are very good. I can't believe they agreed to this. This must be these two jokers, their bosses, fixing it up themselves and getting themselves into a fix, China in particular. Well, I don't want to go into this, but in other words, what I'm trying to say is all the headwinds from US-China relations have been enhanced by Ukraine, and are here to stay over the long run. I don't think they're going to go away. We'll just have to live with it. And that's why I began with that statement that people 45 or younger grew up, had their most formative experiences in a very abnormal period of history. We are now back to a more normal period of world history, of contested world order. And the contest will, on occasion, as in Ukraine, be violent. Right? And we had just better get used to it. We all survived the Cold War. Right? Some of us, in fact, did moderately well from the Cold War. But after the Cold War, we lost the instincts that help us navigate those very treacherous waters. And we'll have to recreate those instincts, relearn them in a hurry, because all the uncertainties you see are not going to go away. They'll probably get worse before they get better. We can talk about that more in question time, but now let me get to ASEAN Centrality and the Mekong. Now, ASEAN Centrality means very different things to different people, and of course it means different things in different contexts. And as contexts change and circumstances change, ASEAN Centrality, the meaning of ASEAN Centrality, or the many meanings, also evolve. All right? But at its core, there is a core meaning. And it's a very simple meaning, actually. At its core, ASEAN Centrality means being useful. If ASEAN is not useful, it cannot be central. It has to be useful to its members. It has to be useful to external parties who have interest in Southeast Asia. Now, to be useful doesn't mean that you have strategic weight, by the way. And ASEAN, while important, is not a big strategic player, despite what we like to pretend. I think I should remind you at this point, although my friends very kindly call you ambassador, me ambassador, I have no official position. My official position is pensioner. Remember that. So I'm not speaking for the Singapore government or anyway, right?
Pension.
I got a pension, that's good.
That's what? Me too.
Yeah, that's right. So we are both pensioners, all right? So, look, the strategic center of gravity of East Asia has always been in the Northeast, never in the Southeast, right? And the Southeast Asia has always been an arena, a place where the interests of major powers intersect and sometimes collide. But it is not central because we are strategically that important. An arena is important as a place, not as an actor necessarily. And I think we should not forget that. We try to pretend otherwise, but we should not forget it, right? I mean, believing your own propaganda is always very dangerous, so we shouldn't do that. Geography makes us an arena, but that's not being central. Being central means being useful. How to make ASEAN useful is a question that we should always wake up every day and ask ourselves. Another way of putting it is, how do we keep ASEAN relevant? I don't think there's any magic formula for this, but there are two key areas where ASEAN has to keep itself useful. One, it has to be useful for its members, obviously, right? And I think it is still quite useful for its members because it is one of the instruments with which member states use to conduct their relations with each other. It's not the only instrument, and it never will be the only instrument. The main instrument for all of us will always be bilateral. But it is nonetheless a very useful supplementary instrument to manage relations among its members. And don't forget, Southeast Asia is not a region where stability in relations among the countries that make up the region is to be taken for granted. It cannot be taken for granted, and so we'll need something like ASEAN. Even if it didn't exist, we'll have to invent something like that. But relationships among members, I don't think is enough to ensure ASEAN centrality in the form of which I've been defining it, usefulness and relevance, right? To ensure ASEAN centrality in the international relations of Southeast Asia requires ASEAN to make itself useful, to keep itself relevant to external powers that have interests in this region. Once upon a time, ASEAN, and it's still on the ASEAN books, although I, for one, or we in Singapore, for one, never took it very seriously, had the idea of making Southeast Asia a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And that idea was based on a very superficially attractive but actually ridiculous idea that all the troubles of the region were caused by the intrusions of major powers. And if you could somehow keep them out, everything, milk, honey, music will play, everything will live happily ever after. It ignored two inconvenient questions. One, what do you do if the major powers refuse to be kept out? How do you keep them out? And two, at least one major power is contiguous to the region, it's part of the region. That's China. It shares borders with Southeast Asia. Southwestern China is part of Southeast Asia, right? So it's a ridiculous idea. It's still on the books, but anyway, Singapore never took it seriously. Singapore does not take this idea of a zone of peace, a nuclear weapon-free zone, which is a corollary of ZOFAN, seriously either. In fact, I spent a lot of my youth ensuring that this idea was harmless before we decided to sign on to it, okay? But, so we can't, when you think of how to make yourself useful and relevant, you have to think in a very cold-blooded, clinical, realistic way. These ideas like ZOFAN, Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, they are great ideas. They don't do any harm, provided you don't take them too seriously, okay? So, but usefulness and relevance are not themselves stable concepts. They have to be understood situationally and conditionally, according to the contingencies of particular circumstances, and as circumstances change, their definitions also have to change. And I don't think we have kept up with the major geopolitical uncertainties arising from Ukraine and more importantly from US-China relations, which are going to characterize international relations for a very, very long time to come. We haven't at all. You're not going to become central by just sitting down here and reciting as if it's some kind of Buddhist sutra, I'm central, I'm central, I'm central, You're not even going to be central because your partners are polite enough to call you central. They don't mean it most of the time, believe me. Right? All right? Whatever we do to keep ourselves central must be based on a clinical, cold-blooded and clear-eyed and unsentimental assessment of what are our interests, what are our national interests as individual members of ASEAN, and what are our regional interests as members of ASEAN. And the two things are not contradictory, You don't have to define your national interests totally in terms of the regional interests. Nobody does. But once you are a member of a regional organization, you have to at least, in part, define your national interests in terms of regional interests. That part, which is the regional interest, can be larger, can be smaller, and it will vary from different issues, but it must be present. And I think, and as I said, and I want to stress this again, we have to calculate our interests, regional and national, in a very clear-eyed and cold-blooded manner. And that is something that ASEAN has lost, unfortunately, I think, in recent years. And I'll give you two examples. One is the Myanmar issue. I think it was correct and necessary that we had a 5-point consensus of basic principles that we expect our members to abide by. That's correct. But I think we also should know that those principles, those 5 points, most of them are aspirational. They can't be implemented. Think about it. If the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, is a kind of institution that can exercise restraint in its dealings with civilians, that will forswear the use of violence against its own people, if it was willing to engage in a genuine dialogue with its political opponents, and if it's willing to have a third party mediate dialogue with its political opponents, then that organization wouldn't have pulled a coup in the first place. So if it pulled a coup, by definition, you are not going to abide by these things. That's the hard fact, right? So, but it was correct to set this baseline of what we consider acceptable behavior as an aspiration. But it was a serious mistake to get carried away and exclude the State Administration Council from ASEAN meetings until it abided by principles it was never going to abide in the first place. What does that mean? That means you have marginalized yourself. Because how are you going to influence the Tatmadaw? It's always going to be very difficult to influence the Tatmadaw. The last time they did this kind of thing, it took 20 years. But 20 years of talking to them. If you don't talk to somebody, how do you influence them? They can't read your mind. They're not interested in reading your mind. right? So it was a big mistake to exclude them. Now, how do we get them back in? In other words, we got on a high horse without any way of getting off it, which is stupid, which is sentimental thinking rather than clinical strategic thinking. We spent 20 years telling the West, Europeans in particular, that it was pointless to try to isolate the Tatmadaw because they do not fear isolation. They did a very good job of isolating themselves for 50 years, better job than any of us can do, right? So, but now we are making the same mistake. And you can't isolate the Tatmadaw. They are always going to have a back door to China, a side door to India, and another side door to Thailand. And they have got, they don't have a border with Russia, but they have got Russia to supply them arms. I don't think anybody else in Southeast Asia is ever going to buy Russian arms again, except those like Vietnam. We have got a big stock. You have to keep them operational. So Tatmadaw, so it's not point. So we have done, it was our own goal that ASEAN scored against itself, and its lack of strategic thinking. The other, and this got very serious consequences. There are two ASEAN countries that have borders with Myanmar. That's Thailand and Laos. Thailand has a very long border, and Laos has a very short border, but still an important border. That means they can't afford, to be very frank, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, that took the lead in pushing for this very stupid position of ASEAN, right? Have no borders with Myanmar. It's costless to us to strike a heroic posture on a high horse. But I don't think a country with borders with Myanmar can just posture forever. Sooner or later, Thailand will break with the ASEAN consensus, and I think Laos will follow. And frankly, I think also Cambodia and probably Vietnam, whom I don't believe are very happy with the present ASEAN position, will follow. And that creates another split in ASEAN that we don't need. Well, that's one idea, one consequence of thinking sentimentally rather than strategically and realistically. The other one, very briefly before I go to the Mekong, is Timor-Leste. We look set to admit Timor-Leste, which is a basket case. Timor-Leste is a failing state, and I don't see it succeeding ever. You know, it's got a small, uneducated population. The same three jokers have been in charge since there have been Their oil field is running out. They are already arguing about what to do with the trust fund from that oil field. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And we, in our infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, have decided to admit it after keeping it out for a long time. In other words, what is going to happen? You're going to have one basket case in the north, that's Myanmar, and one in the south, that's Timor-Leste. And this is all both own goals, right? Now, that is not a way to make yourself central. That's a way to make yourself a laughing stock. Now, we can talk about why we have lost this strategic realism that used to characterize ASEAN thinking later on, maybe. But let me get to the Mekong issue. Or rather, what role does ASEAN play on the Mekong issues? The simple answer is no role. I may be wrong, but by the time I retired for the first time in 2013, I can only remember one occasion in which the Mekong issues was mentioned at the summit level in ASEAN. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. And that is in 2012, when Prime Minister Hun Sen raised it in the summit with the President of Laos at that time. And that discussion took all of 2 minutes, I think. That's the only time, right? Now, how can ASEAN pretend to be central when it ignores an issue that is of quite critical importance to half its membership? The simple answer is it can't. Now, we spend a lot of time on the South China Sea, as you mentioned, but the land, or rather the river that flows through the land, is as important as the sea. And I don't think it is sustainable for ASEAN to ignore this forever. We have to look at Southeast Asia holistically, integrating land and sea, if we are going to be able to navigate the greater and greater complexities of our environment going forward. Secondly, I think we have to not just introduce it into the ASEAN agenda. Right now, in the various sub-regional forums in which Mekong issues are discussed, they are discussed largely as technical issues. water management, water flow, environmental issues. Now, these are all very important things, but they have to be placed in a strategic framework in order for us to integrate them properly into the ASEAN agenda. We can't just relegate these things to, let's say, the environmental ministers meeting, which is not very effective, by the way, or some other sub-regional, We have to bring it into the agenda of the main ASEAN forums, which are the foreign ministers meeting, the defense ministers meeting, the summit, and the ACC. Right? If we don't do that, we cannot pretend. If we ignore an issue, we continue ignoring an issue that is almost existential to some members of the ASEAN countries, how can we pretend to be central? Now, I think when we have to face, when we think through how to keep ourselves useful and relevant, we have to admit that to all our dialogue partners, and particularly the US and to China, which is the two main ones, ASEAN is a convenience, it is not a necessity. They use ASEAN because it's convenient to them for certain purposes. And it's convenient to them because ASEAN is, so far at least, coherent enough to be occasionally useful to them, but not so strong that we can stop their most serious interests. I always like to use the example of the veto that the permanent members of the Security Council enjoy. It's obviously a derogation from the idea of sovereign equality of states, but that's the only reason why the UN has survived, whereas its predecessor, the League of Nations, did not. And ASEAN survives because it is useful enough, but not so strong that it can stymie the most important interests of the major powers. So we are a convenience, not a necessity. I think we should never forget that. Again, let's not believe our own propaganda just because we call ourselves central, that we are really central. And it's not just the US and China. If push comes to shove, I'm not saying they're eager to it, countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, they can also advance their interests in Southeast Asia bilaterally or unilaterally. And they are already beginning to do so, I think. ASEAN is not the only instrument, not just to its members, it's not the only instrument available to our dialogue partners too. There is nothing magic in the word multilateralism, whether we use it in a regional context or in global context. Multilateralism is one tool in a toolkit that has many tools. And that tool is not always going to be useful for every purpose. You can't use a screwdriver I suppose you could use a screwdriver to hit a nail into a piece of wood, but it's not going to go in very straight. So let's not pretend that we are essential. We are not. We have to think every day how to make ourselves essential, how to make ourselves useful. And I think that exercise is not something that ASEAN has gone through for a very long time. We take our usefulness for granted, and that's a very dangerous thing to do, because that's one sure way to use it. Now, let me just end with very briefly saying, why have we lost this strategic realism? I think there are three main regions. One is personality, certain personalities who are among ASEAN leaders right now. Second, I think, is we expanded too quickly without enough thought of how to socialize new members. If you go and look in the archives of the Foreign Ministry, you will find a long telegram that I sent back from New York in 1995, where some of us were asked what we thought about ASEAN expansion. And my answer was that we have to, it's not a question of whether we expand, but when we expand and at what pace we expand. In fact, I'm not just saying this because I happen in Vietnam. My own preference, we let Vietnam in first. The rest can wait, because Vietnam is a strategically important country. And Vietnam had a strategic outlook, although we were on different sides for 10 years, that was quite similar to ours. In other words, we think strategically, which was not the case, you can always say, of the other new members, all right? Well, anyway, that's water under the bridge. But that's the second reason. I think we expanded too quickly without enough thought about how we socialize new members into the mores and practices of ASEAN. And the third reason, I think, is the most controversial. The original 5 or 6 ASEAN members were able to take very difficult decisions for one very simple, politically incorrect reason. None of us were democracies. Think about it. Thailand was under military rule. So was the Philippines. So was Indonesia. Brunei is an absolute monarchy. Singapore and Malaysia were effectively one-party states. So we didn't have to worry. When I joined the foreign ministry 2,000 years ago, we didn't really have to worry too much in making foreign policy about domestic opinion. We thought about what was necessary in a very insulated way, and we did it. Now that's not possible. That's not possible in any of the ASEAN countries, irrespective of what political system you have. Even in Brunei, which is an absolute monarchy, they can't do it anymore. The times have changed. So I'm not saying that I want to go back to the good old days or the bad old days. That's impossible. I'm just telling you as an empirical fact, one of the reasons why we have lost some of the clinical realism we had is because we are all operating in different domestic environments. And we have not yet quite learned how to navigate that properly. None of us. And I think when the Mekong issue, one of the reasons why Mekong does not play any role in ASEAN can be attributed to that last factor. Because look, Vietnam aside, I don't think in Thailand, for example, there is a consensus on whether or not the Mekong should be put on the ASEAN agenda. Some Thais think it ought, some Thais think it doesn't, and they haven't come to any internal agenda. Ditto for Myanmar, ditto for Timor-Leste, in that case it's Indonesia and so on. But this is the reality. There's no point wringing our hands in despair. We'll have to learn to better navigate these new internal realities of ASEAN. Now I'll stop here and maybe we can have questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bilari Kosikan, for your keynote speech. Actually, you raised a lot of issues that we need to think greatly what will be before us, including the geopolitical circumstances that we have now, the question of ASEAN centrality, and how that ASEAN role with regard to the Mekong Sub-region. And also, within ourselves, ASEAN and the Mekong Sub-region, we have programs as well. And how we can engage ourselves within ASEAN and ourselves with the dialogue partners would be an important issue. But I still think it's too short for a keynote speech, right?
I can go on some more if you want, I can go on this evening.
I think we need more on that one, yeah. But certainly as we still have time, and I would open the floor for questions and comments or whatever on...
Let me make one more point about the Mekong.
Sure, one more point of half an hour. That's good.
Oh, okay.
Great.
You can think about it for half an hour. I won't take so long.
No,
I think one of the things, look, it's going to be difficult. I think, Vin, you are absolutely right. The Mekong issue is not just an issue between ASEAN and China. There are intra-riparian state issues too. Laos and Cambodia, I mentioned briefly. Right? That's the only time it ever was discussed that I can remember in ASEAN. Right? So it's going to be very complicated. But of course, the main issue is China. And we are not unique in this sense, All the major Asian rivers originate in China. Now, it is to me axiomatic when small countries are dealing with a big country not to deal with the issue, as far as possible, bilaterally, multilateralize it. Right? And you have, I think, about 17 countries, if I remember correctly, whose major river in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and in Central Asia, whose major rivers originate in China. And they all have, more or less, with different degrees of intensity, more or less the same concerns. So you have at least the nucleus of of a multilateral coalition to put together, and China should be part of that coalition to discuss it in that framework. You also have actually a UN instrument that you could use. It's not a very good instrument, but there is a UN convention on the non-navigable uses of international waterways. Only one ASEAN country has signed on to it, that's Vietnam. One ASEAN riparian state. I mean, I'm not sure Singapore can sign on to it because the Singapore River is not an international water. It's not even a river, it's a little stream, okay? But there is this instrument. Why is only Vietnam a party to it? I'm not saying it's a very strong instrument, right? But it is better than nothing, and we are not. So I think, it's another example of us not thinking strategically about an issue that is actually of great strategic consequence. You can't forever argue that this is not of concern to, say, Singapore or Malaysia or Philippines or Indonesia. By that same logic, you could argue that the South China Sea is of no consequence to Myanmar or Laos, which is landlocked after all, or even Cambodia, right? But we don't argue it that way. Why do we exclude this? I don't know. I don't really have a good understanding of why we did this, but I don't think this is sustainable. As for a start, we should discuss, at least the riparian states could discuss, why not sign on, get the other riparian states, the other 4, to sign on to that UN convention, as a start. Why not get together an informal caucus of countries in the UN or some other forum of countries whose major rivers originate in the Tibetan plateau and therefore all have the same concerns. I don't know why we can't start that way. Okay, I'll stop here.
Great. Actually, we can and we need to start something.
I know you tried when Vietnam was the chair.
Even with previous comments by Bilari Kosikan, including his articles here and there in the region and in the world. Number one, I quote you here, maybe an article from 2021. ASEAN needs to discard a narrow transactional approach towards Mekong issues and think about Southeast Asia holistically as one strategic theater. I think that will be a great vision to see ASEAN, Southeast Asia as a whole. The mainland Southeast Asia and the maritime Southeast Asia need to be together to make ASEAN. And so you already mentioned that half of ASEAN members are in challenges. ASEAN is not happy.
Yeah.
ASEAN is not happy. But from that vision, we face a number of facts. Fact number one, ASEAN is very little engaged until now on the Mekong issue, except for sub-regional building blocks for ASEAN community. But the whole issue is not about just technical issues. It's more about how to maintain sustainability and peace and harmony in this region. It's more than that. And another fact is that many riparian countries will be involved, including China, but all the current regional frameworks, one way or the other, we cannot engage China in water management, but just in technical issues, poverty reduction or infrastructure or whatever. And point number 3, I think in your words, what we need to do is not to ask ASEAN to involve here, but the riparian state, the Mekong countries have to go first to ask ASEAN to be involved before we can do anything. So these 3 facts with one vision, you need to think. So I open the floor for comments and Q&A. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments on this one for the keynote speech? We still have time for more Q&A, but we have some time for this. at the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. When listening to Ambassador Bilahari Kausukan, yes, it's very impressive, very impressive. But I have one question here, that the Mekong region is very important to ASEAN, to the countries in this region, because the Mekong region encompasses 5 ASEAN countries, and it's very important. And it's only important to the countries in the region, but it also attracted the attention, the investment from many outside countries, like the US, Japan, China, South Korea, and others, very important. But it seems that the ASEAN, some ASEAN member countries seem to be a little bit reluctant to include the Mekong region issues on the official ASEAN agenda. Why? That is my question is why? Because as I remember, in 1996, ASEAN already established the AMBDC. You remember that? The ASEAN Mekong Basin Development Cooperation. But a few years later, it seemed that this kind of mechanism died out. Yeah. No more active, no more active. Why? Why? That's why. And my question is that what is the reason behind this kind of reluctance of the ASEAN member countries regarding the ASEAN approach to the Mekong region issues? Because now the ASEAN member countries are only looking at the Mekong sub-regional region from the sub-regional perspective, rather than the other official members issues on the official agenda of the association, like South China Sea or the other issues. Some people say that it is because of the sensitivity vis-à-vis China's participation, and the other is the issues of the major powers competition in this region. Are there any other reason behind the reluctance of the ASEAN? Thank you very much.
It's a mystery to me too, right? But I have some guesses, right? First of all, let me reiterate the point. I don't believe it is sustainable for half of ASEAN to ignore an issue that is so important to the other half, right? And that is particularly so when that issue to the land, the mainland Southeast Asia, connects to one of the major powers that is contiguous to Southeast Asia, which is China, right? It is, whether you like it or not, part of the overall strategic competition between the US and China. And it's not that we want to take sides in this thing, but we are involved, whether we cannot not take sides because we are involved, one way or the other. No, it's not a question of choice. Why are we reluctant, or some ASEAN countries? I know when Vietnam was chair, just 2020, in fact, that's when I started thinking about it, and I wrote this article that Vin just mentioned. You tried. But it was rather unfortunate that it was a time of COVID, and what you could do because of the pandemic was rather limited. Right? And the next chair wasn't particularly interested in this thing. I think there are two fundamental reasons. First, I think there isn't a consensus among riparian states whether or not this should be on the mainstream ASEAN agenda. Right? Now, I think the way ASEAN works, my own experience, I'll give you another example, right? I come back to Myanmar, right? It's not exactly the Mekong issue, but it's why did ASEAN take this very stupid position on the Mekong, on the Myanmar, right? I think the simple reason is the two states with borders did not insist strongly enough. If Thailand had put down its foot and said, look, I'm a frontline state, I cannot agree to this because this is silly, we would not have agreed with it, right? It's just that it will not fall so. So the first point is there must be a consensus within the 5 riparian states of ASEAN. Second, I think you hinted at it, and I think I'll say it explicitly. Right? I think China has got something to do with it. I think Chinese pressure on certain riparian states is a factor. That's a fact. Right? Look at all the dams. I mean, China is building about 21 dams, but Laos is also busy building dams. Cambodia was building dams, but I think they suspended it. Who is financing all those dams? It's not Japan. It's not Australia. It's not the EU. It's not India. It's China. So they're actually Chinese dams on Laotian territory. At least Hun Sen, I must say this for Hun Sen, he has a very clear sense of his own interest and Cambodian national interest. He suspended those 2 projects to build dams on Cambodian territory because he got a shock. Tonle Sap did not reverse fully for 3 years in a row. Now that is an existential crisis for Cambodia. Cambodia is really very largely, as you know, still a subsistence agricultural country. Right? It is only at the very beginning of its industrialization. So it's a disaster if this thing... no, the Chinese always say, we never stop the water. Right? And that's probably true in a macro sense. I haven't really studied this very seriously, but I will be willing to guess. If you look at the total volume of water over the whole year, maybe it hasn't changed so much. But the seasonal variation has been completely disrupted. And that's what's important. Isn't it? It's probably also very important to the Delta country in Vietnam. Right? It must be, right? Because that's where it ultimately ends up. Right? If the water is disrupted, I don't see how your rice farmers and all that, over the long run. But I think, this is quite typical. You know it as well as I do. China likes to deal with countries on a bilateral basis for obvious reasons, because it's big, we are small, and therefore we should not. We should multilateralize this issue. We can't deal with every issue on a multilateral basis. By this issue, it is in our interest, right? But do all the riparian states see it as in their interest? I'm not sure about that. I know Vietnam does. I know some people in Thailand do, but not everybody. But I'm not sure, and I think Mr. Hun Sen has woken up, but I'm not sure about Laos, frankly. And I think these 2 reasons are the simple reason why it's such a big issue. Okay, I must admit, we are all very busy. The ASEAN agenda is already very long, right? I think there are more than 1,000 meetings a year, if you take all the sectors, something like that, right? When I was, towards the end of my time in my foreign ministry as permanent secretary, I got some of our people to just go and attend the Mekong Commission. Just go and look, just see what's happening, because we really don't know what was happening. I mean, instinctively, I know this is important, right? How can it not be important? But what the hell is going on there? So I sent a few people. I mean, nobody invited us, Singaporeans are quite thick-skinned. We don't need invitation. We'll just push on the door. If it's open, we'll walk in. Right?
With a cigarette.
Yeah. Or let's walk out. You can't smoke inside. So anyway, we went. But after that, I think my successors and so on got rather busy with other things. I can't blame them. And so we stopped doing that. Right? But I think these are the 2 fundamental reasons. I don't think Laos, for example, sees its interest in the same way as Vietnam does on the Mekong issue. Right? I think Cambodia is coming in the right direction, moving in the right direction. I think Thailand can be persuaded. I think Myanmar, the Mekong is the least important to Myanmar of the ASEAN countries. Right? So Myanmar, whether he wants to come along or not, is neither here nor there. Right? Right? But at least you need to get the 4 to start with. And that has to come from within the riparian states.
Thank you, Ambassador Birari. Actually, there are 2 points here which are very much important. One point is engagement, try to multilateralize this issue so that people can be involved, including the whole ASEAN countries can be involved. But the other one, Bilari Kosikan also mentioned about governance. Starting point is that something needs to be agreed upon by the riparian states, including a reference to what? The convention, UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Waters. Actually, this is a good point, but it's hard to argue on this one. But there must be something in between and how the first steps will be made. Can you comment on that one? Both aspects of multilateralization.
I have one idea. But I'm not sure how to pursue it, right? One of the points I made earlier was that we tend to look at this as technical issues. The Mekong issues, we treat them as technical issues. And there's nothing wrong with that because they are technical issues. But we have to put it in a broader framework. Now, I'm not a climate change scientist or environmental scientist, but I had this idea, which I've been trying to sell to some American friends, to fund a study of an environmental study of Southeast Asia in a holistic way, with the land as well as the sea. Because I cannot believe that what happens in the rivers doesn't affect the sea, and what happens in the sea doesn't affect the climate, and all around. I just can't believe that it's so separate, right? So to start with, we could use the environment as the tool, not as the end itself, to take a more holistic view, to look at Southeast Asia as one strategic theater, just to start with. That may be a bit less sensitive than to say a way of starting a discussion, at least, that involves everybody. Because the environment involves everybody, it's by definition. You can't escape your environment, right? So that is one idea I had, but I can't find anybody. I go to the US, I've been going to the US even during the pandemic time and trying to interest some people to fund this kind of broad study, right? Which may be a less sensitive way of starting. That you can get the riparian states who are reluctant right now to get involved. You can get the maritime states who are disinterested right now to be a bit more interested. And then you can use, once you start thinking, you start getting used to thinking of Southeast Asia holistically rather than divided into maritime and mainland, then you can go another step and start thinking about mobilizing, internationalizing or multilateralizing this issue. But you got to start somewhere,
Thank you very much. So, floor is open. Ambassador Mike, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Thank you very much, Ambassador Billy Harry, for your very interesting and also striking presentation and remarks. It is interesting because I agree with a lot of points you made in your presentation, including ASEAN now is making a big mistake in excluding Myanmar. I also quite agree with you on the point that ASEAN is not doing a good job of including East Timor, while it is very much a failing state. I agree very much on many points you've made, but I also see your presentation striking because most of the points you made differ from the official position right now of the Singaporean government. So maybe you did not do a good job of training your followers, your staff after your retirement. Now, talking about Mekong, I agree with you also that we have to start with the riparian countries who have the direct interest in the Mekong River issue. But you also know riparian countries have different interests in terms of the dam, in terms of the water security issue, in terms of building hydropower electricity and impacts on the lower Mekong countries. But starting with riparian countries is not enough. We need the strategic views from leaders like Singapore in ASEAN so that Mekong can be a part of ASEAN agenda. Now Singapore is very indifferent, not to say is against having Mekong in ASEAN agenda. So it's very tough for Vietnam and tough for our riparian countries, even they wish to have that in their agenda. So we need strategic leadership from Singapore as well. So please do something to help ASEAN in your capacity, even as a pensioner? Thank you.
Well, I think you will not. I think you need to raise this at the highest level. The way it works in ASEAN, if a country which is a frontline state, whatever the issue, insists, the rest do not resist, because we accommodate each other's most important interests. The problem is kind of chicken, which comes first, right?
Chicken and egg.
Chicken and which comes first, right? There's no real answer, but somebody's got to start. I suspect that if this is raised at the highest level, you will not get a negative view from Singapore. It has not been raised at the highest level. As I said, the only time once I can only remember this being discussed at the summit, and it took like 2 minutes, And most of the other leaders didn't know what they were talking about, I am sure. Hun Sen said something, and
The translator.
didn't know, right? You were there, right? You were there, right? Hun Sen said something, the Lao president barked back, and then it was over. And most people in the room didn't know what happened. But I think this has to be taken up. Let's say I'm just it's not a suggestion, just a scenario, right? If your prime minister, Vietnamese prime minister, goes to Singapore prime minister, Malaysian prime minister, Indonesian president, and Philippine president, and say, look, this is very important to me.
Or we can go to Germany.
Germany later, second part. When we need the money, we go to Germany. So if you do that, right, I think it's very difficult for the other leaders to tell you no, right? Right? Because you have to explain. I don't think it is malice that the maritime states have disinterest. It's just lack of any information of what's going on. Right? I happen to get a little bit interested, so I went to find out. All right? But if you don't go and look, nobody will. If nobody brings this to our attention, we wouldn't know, right? So I think that's the first step. Right? Better still if you and Thailand or Cambodia or somebody can come and do it together. But you have to take the first step, right? Frankly, I gave this same advice to a Thai friend. It's no point coming and grumbling at me that ASEAN position on Myanmar is stupid. You better go and tell the other leaders that it's stupid and I cannot sustain this forever. Right? Right? So I think we have to do something about this. And I think the need is urgent because I told you the environment is not going to get simpler, it's going to get more complicated for all of us.
Actually, there was a case in ASEAN, and Ambassador Bilari Kosikan has been very much aware of the haze issue.
Yeah.
When there was forest fire and the haze is everywhere, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, there was heated debates.
Yeah.
And finally, we can find something between the countries concerned. So it's not about the Mekong as the whole issue strategically, but also if there is something really serious, the droughts or the floods or whatever, you can raise it at the highest level.
No, you can.
At one point in time, raise the issue.
No, you can. You see, I'll give you another one. Before
Please.
Vietnam was joining ASEAN, we had a bilateral issue over air service agreements with Australia. If you remember, that's long ago. You probably don't remember. It's very, very long time ago. And the other ASEAN, it was very important to Singapore because we were in the early stages of becoming an aviation hub. But it was not really of great interest to Malaysia or Indonesia or Philippines, or Thailand, right? Because they were not that interested in becoming aviation hubs there. But we went to told them, look, this is very important to us. What else is ASEAN for? If we don't help each other on issues that are critical importance. And they came to us. And we all went, 5 of us then, to see Australia. And Australia said, okay, if it's 5 of you, all right, I won't be so nasty. So I think it can be done, We have done it before. All right? But somebody has to take the first step.
That's true. That's good advice. The floor is open. So, Ambassador, please.
Sorry, this is not a right of reply. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bilahari, for your statements. You identified great power competition as being the key challenge for this region. Obviously, if that competition escalates into conflict, it'll be enormously consequential for ASEAN countries, whether they are involved or not. It'll hit all of us. We hear a lot from your colleague Kishore Mahbubani about what sort of action should be appropriate from ASEAN to deal with the prospect of this conflict. But I'd be interested to hear more from you about what ASEAN can do proactively within the limits of its power that you've identified to put some sort of guardrails around the competition so that we can do what we can to avoid it escalating.
First of all, let me say I cannot take Kishore seriously anymore. Nobody does actually in Singapore, and I suspect in Australia too. All right. So and that's all to the good. I mean, he wants to sell his books. I wish him well. That's fine, right? No, I think there are things that ASEAN can do. I think I have spent a lot of time explaining things. When ASEAN says that we do not wish to take sides, we don't mean that we want to look for the nearest table and hide underneath it. That doesn't work, right? What we mean is we want to be able to choose our own interests and define our own interests for ourselves. Now, sometimes our interests will take us, I use Singapore as an example, right? It's very clear our Singapore's defense and security interests are much more aligned with the US than they are with China, right? It's not that we are not an American ally. We do not want to be an American ally. We do not wish or believe that the Americans will ever defend us. We only want two things from the Americans. We want them to sell us the advanced technological weapons that we can get nowhere else, particularly fighter aircraft, and to hold the big balance of power. So within that big balance of power, we can maintain deterrence. So on that thing, we are in order to get access to American technology, we have to make ourselves useful to the Americans in a defense way, and we do, right? But that doesn't mean that we agree with them and everything. On that specific area, security area, we are tilted towards America, but not because we are trying to do America a favor. We are doing ourselves a favor. Right? We are advancing our own interests. But on other things, for example, on the American insistence that only their definition of democracy is a valid definition, we are frankly much more in agreement with the Chinese position than in any Western country. Right? We think that democracy has many forms, right? And you can't say that one is more valid than another form. In other words, when ASEAN says we do not want to take sides, what we really mean is that we want to take our own side, whichever way it leads us. On some issues, it may lead us in a direction that looks like it is leaning towards China. In some other issues, it may take us in a direction that looks like it's leaning towards Australia or Japan or India or some other country, right? I had great difficulty, for example, right now, right? ASEAN, Singapore took a very strong position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I had great difficulty in explaining to some European ambassadors that we are doing this in our own interest, and our own interests have got very little to do. There's some overlap with how you define this. And some of them, in fact, got a little bit offended when I told them that. Right? Well, I said, no, it's a question of national interest. And our national interest, it's not we are taking side. In fact, our Prime Minister just said so in our National Day rally speech. We are not taking sides with Ukraine or the US against Russia. We are taking our own, we are doing this in our own interest, right? And that's what ASEAN should do. What we can do is, look, you don't have to do every damn thing that the Americans tell you to do, nor do you have to do every damn thing that the Chinese tell you to do. But what you have to do is, what we can do is, I think Vietnam does it and we do it, is you go to the American and Chinese and tell them, this I'm prepared to do with you, this I'm not. Right? You draw parameters for what you are prepared to do and what you are not prepared to do. And both are equally important. And that's how, I guess, Singapore generally operates. You know, particularly with China, but also with the US. We have had to draw red lines with both. And we will also indicate, yes, on this other issue, we can work with you. Not a problem, because it's in my interest. And on some interests, we will say, on some issues we have, say, a plague on both your houses, the hell with both of you, will go our own way. They're not very happy about this, but it can be done. And that's what ASEAN should do too. Draw parameters. We haven't done that. We just sit down and say we are central, we are central, we are central, rather pathetically.
Thank you, Bilari. I think we come to a time for a break, is it?
Can I have one more question?
Oh, please, one more question.
Thank you, Ambassador. In your wonderful remarks, you described the past decades of world history as being very abnormal. And you say that the age of contestation is back and that should be seen as normal. And you criticize ASEAN for having lost sense of realism in that world. And you suggested that ASEAN needs to retrain itself with some instincts. So can you give us more precise opinion on what are those instincts that ASEAN needs to train itself with in order to survive in this age of contestation?
First of all, I think at different levels in ASEAN, right, which we have not done for a very long time. We have pretended to do it, but we haven't really done it. To sit down, as we did in the late 70s and 80s among ASEAN, there's only 5 or 6 of us then, and say, okay, this is our interest. And it was a very heated debate. Okay, I don't want to raise sensitive issues, but I spent 10 years of my life fighting with people like him, you know, right? But that's why we are friends now, right? And the most difficult thing in that 1980s was not fighting with you. It was fighting among ASEAN to get a common position. And that was the most difficult thing. And that was the most sensitive thing, right? And if you look at ASEAN's history, from the very beginning, 1967, Mr. Rajaratnam got up and was walking out of the room, refusing to sign the Bangkok Declaration. Because we cannot accept that Indonesia wanted something about foreign bases being alien, you know, and it should be done away with, right? So, and we nearly did not sign the Bangkok Declaration because of that, right? Until we found a formula that they are temporary, they have been temporary forever, right? So I think first thing we have to have this kind of discussion, very honest discussion among the 10 ASEAN countries, about what are our interests in this new world or this old world comeback, right? All right, what is our interest? Secondly, I think we need to, the instinct we have lost actually, is that one of looking at things in a cold-blooded way, in a realistic way. I think Vietnam has always looked at the world that way, and Singapore largely too, right? Because if not, we wouldn't be here, you know, right? One of the things that you know, everybody in Singapore is not took offense with Kishore, is he's saying that small states should behave like small states, right? If small states really must behave like small states, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. Singapore shouldn't exist. You know? And Vietnam wouldn't have been reunited, right? If you believe that if you are small, you have to behave in a deferential way to big countries, right? In fact, there wouldn't be a Vietnam because China would have absorbed you long ago, right? Because Singapore and Vietnam have this in common. We don't believe that small countries should behave like small countries. That's why we exist. Or we believe that there is always some agency. Now, I think that confidence, right, that there is always something you can do is at least very diluted in the ASEAN circle nowadays, right? The third thing we can do and we should do is, frankly, a simple thing. Don't get too excited. We have been through this before, right? I'm not saying take it lightly. That's a different issue. But don't get so excited that you are in a state of panic, right? Which I believe some ASEAN countries, which are not too far from where we are sitting, got themselves into a state of panic and thought that they have no agency vis-a-vis a big power, which is not true. Even the smallest country can do something, provided you keep calm.
Actually, I joined Ambassador Bilari Kosikan to say that ASEAN these days need to look at itself and how it can best doing its job. One of my personal observations is that ASEAN has been hostage to its own success, especially after it adopted new organizational structure and the charter. We busy our leaders with nonsense, with all the prepared talking points. That's not good. You need more informal retreat to talk about strategic interests and issues related to ASEAN. Nowadays, you prepare all the statements and have the leaders going there to read. That's not good for ASEAN. That's not good for ASEAN. It was my time also because 2008 we have the charter. We have a new mechanisms of ASEAN and so many meetings and everybody want to expand the activities that involve the leaders. So the leaders do not have time to stay among themselves personally and talk about strategic issues. So this is one point that we need ASEAN to be back. So I think we still have more time for Q&A and comments, but the first round of initial comments on the keynote speech by Ambassador Bilari Kosikan has been quite noisy, and we love that one, but official commentators will be later on in the second half of our forum. We will have Dr. Lê Thu Hương and Dr. Pham Hung Sơn for the second part of that one. And so we have about 10 minutes break until 3:30. So thank you. We will have a coffee break. Thank you very much.
told her we were drinking last night and she...
So can I call the meeting to order? The first session was very much interesting, and I think the second section will be more interesting. We will have two commentators, principal commentators, Dr. Lê Thu Hương and Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn. We start first with Dr. Lê Thu Hương. She used to be with the ASEAN Society in New York, right? And now is the Principal Policy Fellow of Perth US Asia Center in Australia. So may I invite you, Dr. Lê Thu Hương, for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bing. It's great pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. I wish I were with you in Hanoi, but I hope I can make it up soon. For me to offer a very few frank thoughts, I think also very frank because my date back to my training in Singapore as I try to start my fintech career, but those gotta be my views only. I think I don't have to remind anyone in the audience of the importance of Mekong. We've already discussed that in the first session. My comments will be about the multilateral approach and actually the limits towards that, because like Ambassador Bilahari outlined, there are a lot of challenges to multilateralism in general. So it's not just, I think, an issue for ASEAN to adopt either Mekong or any other issue. It's actually, that is multilateralism itself that is weakening. There are limitations that issues like Mekong and many other issues, including bigger issues like climate and technology, energy transition, and many other issues that needs a multilateral approach. Yet we are seeing that multilateralism gradually is not becoming the first option to go to. And it's not, for this context in particular, it's not about any other institutions or individual institutions that may challenge ASEAN centrality or any other forces, whether it's Quad, whether it's China, whether other new trends emerging. I think it's just a general anti-multilateralism forces and great power competition and politicization of international community that don't help that multilateral approach. And we can see it in example from the Russia-Ukraine war, right? It makes those who many don't want to share the same platform with those that they consider as violators of international law. And in here in our ASEAN backyard, there would be an issue with, for example, Myanmar, which will not be for some time a fully functional member for us in ASEAN. And there are internal debate what to do with ASEAN membership. And Myanmar is important because it's one of the Mekong countries, right? So I think the issue of Mekong do struggle to gain momentum. There is some more attention to issue compared to what Ambassador Bilahari mentioned in 2013 when there was this 2 minutes mentioned. There are limited attention, but there are those within certain groups of informed experts, group of informed countries that do place importance of Mekong strategically, ecologically, and also economically. But I think the challenge will be, and for those limited groups, such as this dialogue itself, and people that you've gathered, they are acutely aware of the challenges and implications of Mekong. But it will be really hard to elevate it further and make it a mainstream focus. There are already a range, many of them actually long-running in operation dialogues and mechanisms, but they have proven, and they still have value, I do think they have value, but they have proven unable to prevent deterioration of what's happening in Mekong and how Mekong resources are being managed or mismanaged. I personally think that this year is a bit of wasted opportunity for ASEAN to elevate Mekong to the pan-ASEAN level. Vietnam has done some progress in 2020 when it was the chair, but that lost a little bit of momentum afterwards. You would think that Cambodia being this year's chair and Thailand being chair of APEC would be able to bring back that momentum and bring Mekong to the forefront. But so far, I don't see it happening as much. I do think it needs a lot of effort from all the members. And as I mentioned, Myanmar will cast a shadow on sub-regional cooperation. Ambassador Bilahari already mentioned Cambodia and Laos in his remarks, but another important player is Thailand, who's been playing a very key role. But with current trend, with the Thai Prime Minister being suspended and gearing to the next election and preoccupation with domestic politics, I think it is unlikely that Thailand would champion the Mekong diplomacy beyond in the sub-region as well as beyond. So much of that diplomatic heavyweight lifting will lie upon Vietnam, actually. And that socialization and promotion of Mekong issues that Ambassador Bilahari referred to. There are, of course, already spreading some attention to non-riparian countries, including external powers, so to speak. So, for example, the US has the US-Mekong Partnership. Australia has its own dialogue Mekong. Japan has an infrastructure focus in its Indo-Pacific strategy that focuses on mainland Southeast Asia and Mekong countries. So it does get some due attention. But in terms of strategic focus, I think they remain auxiliary rather than central pillars. And I think what is likely to be transforming into is that Mekong will become a slow-burning but continuously deteriorating crisis. And we're not very good with responding to slow-burning crises. We're much better and faster in responding to major outbreaks, but the slow-burning ones become gradually fait accompli. And we've seen that before. That is likely to aggravate the power asymmetry between China and the lower Mekong countries. And that gap will grow, I think. China's thirst for energy and resources also will only grow. Post-COVID, given the contraction from its zero-COVID strategy, it's likely to be exaggerated. And so is the energy demand from the rapidly urbanizing and industrializing and demographically growing Southeast Asia. So the key point here is not just strategy, but also how the countries in Mekong are going to manage their energy transition. Hydropower dams is an issue, and the construction and operation is not just a matter of energy security. It is a matter of geopolitical implications. And as we've learned from the Russia-Ukraine war and its impact globally, energy security is national security. There's no separation there. I think another challenge for Mekong to become elevated at the ASEAN on the higher level is very thin international law base. It remains very thin. Ambassador Bilahari mentioned that only Vietnam is a signatory, and also to a convention, and there is very not well known, not well propagated. There is hesitancy among the riparian countries to adopt the law as well. So, for sure, the energy transition is going to be uneven, not necessarily coordinated, and create a further intra-riparian state gap. And they're going to be based on individual needs and conditions and capacity. And some of that may be mutually conflicting, not only with China, but also among the intra-Mekong states, preventing further reaching any consensus on the matter. I think what Southeast Asia needs is safer, greener, and cheaper renewable energy strategy and storage solutions. So a very technical approach, that would be something that probably is easier to reach consensus on rather than a political matter. And actually, Vietnam has a great role to play here because Vietnam in recent years has gone through a solar panel, solar energy revolution. So it's, for example, in terms of rooftop solar installation, it has took over the whole hydropower capacity that Laos has been building over the last 10 to 15 years. So Vietnam is leading that renewable energy revolution and is in a position to lead its neighbors towards those trends. I think the challenge will be for Laos and Cambodia, whose energy development are they're dependent on foreign investment. Vietnam has been growing its own demand and transition, both by domestic-driven policies, but also external investments. So Vietnam is in a better position for sure to negotiate power purchases and energy transition downstream, and that way can also affect the market, which, for example, Laos and Cambodia are looking at in the energy market. And finally, and that will need further sharing of the knowledge and technology, which may create, which will be helpful in creating a common base for those countries. The role of external powers, again, are very, partners actually are very important. Japan, Australia, ROK, EU, and including Germany are essential in this sustainable energy transition and sustainable in climate-focused solutions, as well as capacity training, technical training, and assistance in data collection and disseminations. Those are practical and technical issues that are less sensitive, politically sensitive, but their involvement, as much as they are welcome, I think needs to be also very careful because of the sensitivity and lack of consensus, sensitivity over sovereignty in those countries, and lack of consensus to what degree the riparian states want to actually internationalize the Mekong issue. So again, if you compare with South China Sea, for example, which has a wide bigger base for claiming for external actors to claim the global commons or navigation rights or trade interests, Mekong is much more limited in that aspect as well. So it's harder for non-riparian, non-Mekong countries to get involved. I think those are key challenges that we are all acutely aware, but I think there are real challenges for Mekong to become a pan-ASEAN issue, and therefore I think it will remain at the important level, but unfortunately, as much as I would want to see it a central and priority issue, I think it lacks the momentum, and for now, Vietnam will bear a lot of responsibilities to bring that issue further on and keep the momentum going. I'll stop here and tune in for the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Give her applause. Thank you very much, Dr. Lê Thu Hương, for your analysis and comments. Especially, you have highlighted the whole picture of the issue, including the way to tackle it through a multilateral approach. But at the same time, you mentioned that there could be a number of ways to approach this issue, but beware of how we get the consensus way. And then sometimes we have to do the easier things first and technical things for political purpose. But at the same time, you highlighted also the question of energy or climate change will be very much important to this region. The role of different players, including the riparian states, the ASEAN countries, the dialogue partners, but certainly Vietnam has very much important role to play. I'm not quite sure if Vietnam will be ready to take that one. I challenge you to give ideas on how Vietnam should be doing in this regard. But certainly this issue, as you mentioned, if we can get it as a pan-ASEAN issue, that would be very much important. So that's why we are here to discuss. Thank you very much, Dr. Lê Thu Hước. The second principal commentator on this one will be Dr. Nguyen Hung Sơn. He's the Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, we know already. So you have the floor, Dr. Sơn.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh. Thank you again, Ambassador Koh Sĩ Can, for your wonderful remarks. I'll start by showing my full agreement with you that the defining character that's shaping ASEAN's strategic environment is the return of geopolitical contestation, return of major powers rivalry. And that is the principal challenge to ASEAN centrality, for it risks shifting the balance of power in the region. And ASEAN is not going to be able to operate in an unbalanced environment, because ASEAN is a norm setter, is a norm promoter, and ASEAN would not be able to promote its norms or rules if the balance of power in the region is upset. And the most critical threat to the balance of power in the region is unfortunately in continental part of Southeast Asia rather than in the maritime part of Southeast Asia. Why is it so? Because in the maritime part, we have seen responses from the international community, we have seen responses from other powers globally in their pivot towards the Indo-Pacific. The pivots of the international community into the Indo-Pacific, which is inherently maritime, provides an ample opportunity, or at least for now, to maintain the balance of power in the maritime part of Southeast Asia. Whereas in the continental part of Southeast Asia, we do not see that kind of rebalancing of the international community. Therefore, we are seeing a risk of an imbalance in the continental part of Southeast Asia, and that poses a fundamental risk to ASEAN unity. Now, Ambassador Koh Sĩ Can said that, let's face it, it's a new normal, but don't be too excited because we've gone through it. Singapore certainly have gone through it because ASEAN, as Singapore knew it, has gone through the time of major powers contestation. But newer members like Vietnam certainly is excited because we have not gone through it. ASEAN, as we knew it, the ASEAN 10 has not gone through an age of power contestation. ASEAN, as it is today, has not been trained for this kind of geopolitical competition. Therefore, it was not designed to survive it. It doesn't have the tool. It doesn't have the habit of talking about the hard talk that Ambassador Koh Sĩ Can is alluding to. Therefore, I don't think ASEAN, if it is as it is today, or it has been for the past 30 years, is capable of having the capability to navigate through this major powers contestation. Therefore, I think I fully concur that ASEAN needs to retrain itself. ASEAN needs to relearn some of the instincts. Some of that is new instinct to the newer members, maybe old instincts to the older members. But we have to have that conversation in an ASEAN 10, and let's have all the ASEAN members to face it. Now, including how it can pay more attention to an area so much important to its own unity and integration, but nevertheless has been paid less attention to, and that is the continental part of Southeast Asia. Now, for a reason, it has been called a Mekong region. And that's very logically so, because the Mekong was the medium for connection of the continental part of Southeast Asia for quite a while. But we have to reckon a fact that there is new connectivity happening in the continental part of Southeast Asia, and that is through the new initiative such as the BRI, but also other initiatives that's coming from countries in the region through its various connectivity initiatives, and also supported by ASEAN's dialogue partners such as Japan, such as Australia, such as Korea, European Union. So these new initiatives is going to provide the new dynamics in continental part of Southeast Asia, and that is the new opportunity for ASEAN to will get continental part of Southeast Asia reconnected to ASEAN family as a whole and to regain the balance in that region. An imbalanced continental Southeast Asia is going to be very dangerous to ASEAN unity. Think about Laos, Cambodia. What would they how would they look at ASEAN if they are more connected to other countries outside the region? If ASEAN means less to them, to their development, compared to other dialogue partners of ASEAN, for example. Now, for many of us, for example, the maritime Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, for example, could be a security thing. But for continental part of South Asia, development is their security. And therefore, a connected, developed continental Southeast Asia would be a deep security interest of continental Southeast Asia. So that is to say, I think we have to have a cognitive moment in and about the Mekong region and think about that not just in development sense, but also in security sense, in connectivity sense, in sustainable environment sense, and provide new dynamics to this region. And we can do so, ASEAN can do so by, first of all, recognizing that sub-regional cooperation is a very important dynamics within ASEAN's cooperation in itself. I think ASEAN has been recognizing that sub-regional cooperation is important to its members. But for some reasons, there's some fear within ASEAN that sub-regional cooperation is a challenge to ASEAN overall consensus or might dilute or erode ASEAN consensus as a whole. I think this perception needs to change. ASEAN needs to recognize that if we have a thriving sub-region such as the Mekong or the IMT or BIMYAGA, that is overly good for ASEAN as a whole. We also have to get used to the idea of unilateralism, the idea of several ASEAN countries taking the lead and providing the championship within the organization. That is going to be good for the organization as a whole, so long that they don't go against the ASEAN's vision or ASEAN's principle. For now, it's not been a welcoming thing in ASEAN so far, for fear that that will leave certain members behind. But I think in the new context, this has to change. ASEAN needs to have a better institutionalizations of its ASEAN minus X principles. We all know that through the Myanmar example, that ASEAN still operates within the ASEAN minus X context. The question ASEAN has been asking what it needs to do in light of the Myanmar issue. I think the better question for ASEAN to ask itself is what ASEAN needs to do in spite of the Myanmar issue. And also ASEAN also needs to be very practical in promoting Mekong cooperation. It needs to really talk with its partners in order to really get down to very specific needs of the Mekong countries, such as water security, better management of its dam operation. ASEAN can't prevent the dams from getting built, but certainly there's a better way, more efficient and more environmentally friendly ways of operating those dams. And those are skills, those are knowledge, and it needs to be transferred to the dam operating countries in order for the better management of the water security situation. There needs to be more very specific projects on sustainable developments in support for Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and even Thailand. There has to be more ideas and more investments on connectivity, and this is not just infrastructure, hard roads or bridges, but also internet lines, communications lines to spread connectivity across continental Southeast Asia. And also there needs to be hard talks about security too, because security and non-traditional as well as traditional security can soon be a very severe topic that is going to affect not just the continental Southeast Asian countries alone, but also with broader implications to the broader region. Think about food security. If continental or the Mekong area is not going to be able to contribute its food supplies not only to the region but globally, then the world will have one more region to worry about in terms of food security. So there are a lot of ideas that can be discussed in order to make ASEAN useful or centrality regained in and for continental Southeast Asia or for the Mekong sub-region as a whole, that ASEAN has not been frankly looking at, and even to a certain extent ASEAN has been avoiding to recognize as a way that ASEAN can make itself useful, that now ASEAN really needs to focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, that was a great analysis of the situation, and also recommendations on how ASEAN will be attacking the issue of the Mekong. You talk about what ASEAN should do to be meaningful to its member states and the region. Now we have a lot of challenges, not only to the Mekong sub-region, but also to the whole Southeast Asia region, including geopolitics and major power competitions, the issue of non-traditional security challenges, including food or water security, for example, and a lot of things that ASEAN have been new to these days circumstances. You mentioned that ASEAN should be retrained to adapt itself in a way that it can be able to address the challenges, to be meaningful and to be central in the region. Certainly we have been hoping ASEAN to be doing a lot, but at the same time member states should be asking themselves on how to have a consensus in ASEAN so that ASEAN can be effective tools for the whole region, including the sub-Mekong, the sub-region in the Mekong. And thank you, Dr. Lê Thu Hương, and thank you, Dr. Nguyen Hung Sơn, for your comments. The floor is now open for other analysis or comments and questions, including to the two commentators and the keynote speaker as well. We understand that we face a lot of facts here, challenges in the Mekong, which are not only to the existence of the people here in the region, but also that may affect to the whole region of Southeast Asia and a broader context also. Point number two, want it or not, there have been major power in intervention, engagement, and competition in the sub-Mekong region, and a lot of frameworks over there which are beyond the reach of ASEAN. ASEAN can have some role to play, but it's really beyond the reach of ASEAN. And number three, a lot of challenges in the whole region that happens in the sub-Mekong, Mekong sub-region and other as well. And point number three is that there's a development gap in ASEAN. If we are to build a community, so development gap in the mainland, or you call it continental ASEAN, still there. And we need to do more on that one, not only ASEAN countries, but dialogue partners as well. So the challenges and the facts are still there. What we want to do is to have a whole ASEAN to work together. But how to make ASEAN to do together is now for you to recommend, and you may challenge the commentators and the keynote speaker as well. The floor is open now.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
Short comment. I think I take your points. I think they are good points. But there is one thing about ASEAN that is a dirty secret of ASEAN. Okay? ASEAN is a co-war organization. It was a co-war organization. All the original 5 members were anti-communist. Right? All of the original 5 members faced communist insurgencies supported by China, mainly. So ASEAN has not really yet adopted to the post-Cold War world. We adapted in form by adopting a charter. It was very necessary. But the charter, as we were discussing out just now, actually has substituted in many ways form for substance. And that's not healthy when we are faced with the new geopolitical uncertainties. I think the first step is to understand the new geopolitical uncertainties clinically. The main issue is US-China relations. It's not the only issue, but it is the main issue. It's the main axis around which many other things revolve. But I don't like this description of US-China competition as a new Cold War. I think it is an intellectually lazy way of describing it, and in fact, it misrepresents it in ways that can be dangerous. First of all, the competition between the United States and the former Soviet Union was competition between two systems. Those two systems were connected only at their margins. Right? However, China and the US are both vital, irreplaceable components of one system, which are connected to each other and to the rest of us by a new phenomenon that grew up in that short, abnormal period I talked about. And that new phenomenon are supply chains of a scope, of a density, of a complexity that have never before been seen in world history. We have had other supply chains, but not of the same density and complexity. Now, I don't think, so they are competing within a system. And that's a fundamentally different kind of competition than competition between systems, right? Now, I don't think this one system is going to bifurcate completely. It can't. It's just too costly for both sides. There are several implications of this. One is the US-China competition is very unlikely to end in any clear-cut outcome as the US-Soviet competition did. Second, while both the US and China, may want to dominate this single system, they don't want to fundamentally change it because both have benefited from it. China, in fact, has benefited the most from it, right? So I don't think the Chinese, I think it's wrong, as some Western countries have called it, to call China a revisionist power. It is not a revisionist power.
Everybody is revising it.
But China is a revanchist power. That's a different issue, all right? Revanchist power is just trying to recover what it believes it was its own. That's why it's so difficult to deal with China on, say, South China Sea. It's not something that you can have a diplomatic solution. They say, this is all mine. So why should I compromise? Similarly, in the East China Sea, they say this is all mine. Similarly, in the Himalayas, and maybe one day in Siberia, who knows? Right? Okay. If I was Russian, I would think about this a little bit. So, competition within a system is not likely to result in any clear outcome. Secondly, it is much more complicated, much more complicated than the binary competition of the US-Soviet competition. Let me give you one example. The one example is semiconductors. I think we all know that semiconductors at the high end have emerged as a very serious vulnerability for China because all the most critical nodes in the semiconductor supply chain, which is one of the most complicated ones anyway, are held by the US or its friends or allies. On the other hand, China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. So you cannot possibly cut off your own companies or the companies of your friends and your allies from 40% of the market without doing themselves great damage. So you see, it's not a binary competition. And in fact, despite all the trade war and so on, and all these restrictions on technology and so on, I haven't seen any study, but only one study I've seen by the Wall Street Journal that came out a few months ago, that yes, you have to apply for licenses for practically everything to export to China now. Anything that's got American intellectual property, you need to get a license to sell it to China. And that's almost everything that's got some American intellectual property. However, according to the Wall Street Journal, more than 90% of the applications of the licenses have been approved. So it's not a binary competition. You cannot cut off your own companies from so much of a big market without killing them, right? And you don't want to do that. So it's not binary competition, it's much more complicated. And that complexity is something that I think some ASEAN member states that complexity has paralyzed some ASEAN member states. Now, both the US and China like to have one tactic in common. They like to create false choices and make you choose. Right? Many big powers are more alike than they care to admit. But actually, the choices are not binary anymore. So, in complexity, there is agency. If this was a unipolar world, small countries like us have no room to move. If this was only a bipolar world, small countries like us have some room to move, but less room to move. But this is increasingly a multipolar world. Not multipolar in the way that the Chinese or the Russians like, but it is nonetheless multipolar. Even Southeast Asia is multipolar. Australia and Japan are close allies of the US. But are Australian interests and Japanese interests in Southeast Asia identical to US interests? I don't think so. Right? So even there is agency, there's room to move. Right? Now, that brings me to my last point. I think you are right. I think we should not fear these sub-regional dialogues, and I think the dialogue partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, they are doing quite a lot in the Mekong region. But are they doing this in any way within a strategic framework, or are they just responding to particular problems? I think it's the latter. So I'm not saying they should stop doing all these things. I'm saying that we should find a way, we meaning ASEAN now as a whole, find a way to encourage them to do these things in a more coordinated way. Informally coordinated, not formal coordination. Too much formality is the death of ASEAN, actually. And that is something that I think is not beyond our powers, if we focus our minds to it. Because they're going to do it anyway. Right? You are right, you look at all the infrastructure projects, right? All the Chinese infrastructure projects, the roads, the railways, and all that are going north-south. And that has great geopolitical. So we need the east-west ones. Right? And similarly, there may be scope to this kind of broad coordination for the various more or less technical projects that our dialogue partners, some of them anyway, are doing in the Mekong Sub-region. I think we should think about that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kosikan, for the comments. Certainly, I do agree a lot with you, but the floor is open for other comments and Q&A. Any others?
Ambassador, I believe there are some online questions.
Oh, please. Ambassador Hung, and then we have our online questions. Ambassador Hung.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for taking the floor for the second time, but today we are talking about two topics. The first is ASEAN Centrality, and the other is the challenges facing the Mekong region. I have two questions for Dr. Lê Thu Hương. First is regarding the ASEAN Centrality. How the outside people look at the ASEAN Centrality. How do you assess it? Because it is like Ambassador Bilahari described that ASEAN Centrality is something useful. But as I remember, the former ASEAN Secretary General Surin Pisawan, he described ASEAN Centrality as two things. The first, if the centrality is a centrality of substance, and the second, if the centrality of goodwill. If the ASEAN centrality of substance is a centrality of substance, it is useful, like Ambassador Bilahari described, then it can be used to address something like the challenges of the Mekong region. If the ASEAN centrality, it only has decorative values, it would not be useful. beautiful. So how do the outside people, like you from the Australia, look at the ASEAN centrality? That is my first question. The second question is regarding the challenges to the Mekong region. When the Mekong region is facing a lot of challenges from the natural challenges and from the artificial challenges, like the natural challenges like the climate change, the global warming, the rise of the sea level, etc. But the artificial challenges is like the construction of the dams along the river. So the important thing is that how can we manage the river well? If we can manage the river well, then we can be able to deal with the challenges, both natural and artificial. But we have one organization in the Mekong River, that is the MRC, the Mekong River Commission. And one of the tasks of the Mekong River Commission is to manage the river, But it seems that the task given to the MRC is beyond their ability. So how can, outside countries like Australia help the MRC to improve its management of the river? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Lê Thu Hương, you have the floor. The comments and the question is put directly to you. But others can have a comment later on, but I have the floor for Dr. Lê Thu Hương.
Thank you for your question. Very hard, all hard questions. If I had the solution, I think I would be the new chairman of ASEAN or Mekong Sub-region. I think ASEAN centrality, I think you hit the nail on the head. I doubt there is one unifying definition of ASEAN centrality, even within ASEAN itself. We're talking about different interpretations. Even in academic literature, there's no consensus on what ASEAN centrality means. So like Ambassador Bidari Kostikan said, there's a lot of propaganda, but in terms of substance and how individual countries understand and use that is still very different in different occasions. And I am of the view that ASEAN centrality, however you want to define it, needs to be earned rather than by virtue of claiming it. And so far, majority of the usage of ASEAN centrality these days is a matter of claiming rather than earning. ASEAN has proven ineffective in many ASEAN matters and ASEAN crises, and therefore I don't think it always deserves or earned that ASEAN centrality. Now, critically speaking as well, in terms of how external powers see that, I think this usage has also been very loose. If you ask honestly, I think there would be minority that believes in ASEAN centrality in specific cases, but the use is much more widespread. ASEAN centrality has become now a fixture in all Indo-Pacific languages. All countries claim adherence and respect to the ASEAN centrality in their Indo-Pacific statement or even Quad statement or any other thing, just to acknowledge ASEAN's architecture and diplomacy out of respect. But I think that it means more than recognizing ASEAN as a central position in terms of in the Indo-Pacific new geography, as well as diplomatic. But strategically speaking, if you judge country by country in action, I doubt you can say that for the U.S. Right now. I think the U.S. is constantly being accused of overlooking through ASEAN. So I can't, despite what diplomatic documents may suggest. So there is a huge gap there. It's a right thing to point out for you. The second question on Mekong, I think it comes down to the political will. There is this Mekong River Commission. There are many other dialogues and initiatives. And ASEAN and continental Southeast Asia or Mekong countries are not alien to unilateralism, right? Dr. Sun, they've been doing this for many years with China, without China, among themselves, but there are limits to the use of them. And I think the challenge is being able to share common resources. Every country has a part of the river, wants to manage on its own and not necessarily coordinate its resources management with other countries or even have regard of how it affects the other parts of the river. For example, the more upper stream build more dams does not necessarily take into account the effect of the lower stream countries, and therefore we have the effect we have today. So I think, the artificial challenges do aggravate the natural challenges and then become a common challenge for the whole region. But the fact to, manage the river and resources well and sustainably has been a challenge for decades. How outside countries can help, I think there are limits how they can help. Obviously, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, technical expertise and helping with a scientific research, data, and training would be one way and probably a safer way rather than, there are limits to other ways outside countries to get involved because they simply cannot have that claim of their own interest in the river that they would have with the global commons such as the open sea. So there are limits to what external so-called countries can do other than technical and diplomatic support, but even holding discussions and elevating their awareness about issue and having this kind of conversation and workshop like this helps to promote and make the issue more transparent and make it more widespread and promoted rather than within just a few countries and that know the issue and the problem. So it starts with things like that. This workshop is one of the contribution external partners can partner with riparian countries to do their share.
Thank you very much. Actually, I don't think that within ASEAN ourselves we have the same definition of ASEAN centrality. As vague as it is central. So that's very much good. So thank you very much, Dr. Lê Thu Hương, for your comments. The floor is open and also for online attendance.
One small comment on ASEAN
please,
centrality.
Ambassador Bilari.
When you asked your question, Ambassador, I was reminded, right, very good distinction between centrality of substance and centrality of goodwill, right? But I was reminded of something. Before ASEAN used to talk about being central, we used to talk about ASEAN being in the driver's seat. Except that sometimes the person in the driver's seat is only the chauffeur, we should not forget. So I think that's something that ASEAN should be realistic about, right?
Can I also have some comments, Ambassador?
Please.
Well,
so please.
I think ASEAN centrality is useful. The phrase is useful because of its own ambiguity. The moment we define what centrality is, for example, if we define centrality means neutrality or centrality means equidistancing, that moment ASEAN centrality is going to lose its usefulness because there will be all sorts of different opinions about its meaning. So keep it ambiguous and it's going to be useful.
So thank you very much. Any other questions or comments, including online comments or questions? Anybody will have asked here with the online one? So the floor is open. You are happy with ASEAN centrality? Come back to the Mekong issue. Ambassador Hương, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. But I would like to speak in Vietnamese so that you can understand what I would like to say. Trước hết thì tôi đánh giá rất cao cái hội thảo ngày hôm nay. Tôi cho rằng chúng ta đang tiếp cận đến những vấn đề rất là quan trọng cho sự phát triển của khu vực chúng ta, nhất là ASEAN, khi có cả những nước ở lục địa và những nước ngoài hải đảo. Và hiện nay thì chủ đề của chúng ta bàn đến là vai trò trung tâm của ASEAN trong việc xử lý những thách thức của khu vực tiểu vùng Mekong. Tôi cho rằng hiện nay thì chúng ta có rất nhiều những thách thức. Trước hết, có lẽ đó là vấn đề biến đổi khí hậu, rồi đặc biệt là vấn đề nói ra không nói ra chúng ta cũng thấy đó là vấn đề an ninh nguồn nước, rất quan trọng. Cái thứ hai là các diễn biến về địa chính trị ở trong khu vực và quốc tế cũng đang đặt ra những thách thức rất lớn cho sự phát triển của chúng ta. Cái thứ ba là tôi nghĩ là ngay cái tác động của cái bối cảnh tình hình hiện nay với cách mạng công nghiệp 4.0 nó tác động đến các cái sự phát triển về kinh tế cũng như xã hội ở từng quốc gia cũng như cả khu vực chúng ta. Cái điều nữa thì tôi cũng muốn nói đến là những vấn đề ngay kể cả chúng ta đang coi nó là những cái thuận lợi cho phát triển chúng ta. Ví dụ như là có rất nhiều những nước quan tâm đến sự phát triển của tiểu vùng Mekong, có rất nhiều những cơ chế, nhưng nó có những sự chồng chéo lẫn nhau, và nếu chúng ta không xử lý một cách hợp lý thì có khi nó lại trở thành những cái rào cản, những cái khó khăn. Vậy câu chuyện ở đây thì theo tôi nghĩ, để mà khu vực tiểu vùng Mekong phát triển được ấy, thì chúng ta đương nhiên là phải xử lý những vấn đề thách thức này sao cho nó phù hợp với tình hình hiện nay. Tuy nhiên tôi rất chia sẻ, rất tán thành cái suy nghĩ mà ngài đại sứ Bilahari đã nêu là ngay trong khu vực chúng ta đây, các nước liên quan trực tiếp đây vẫn còn đang rất là thờ ơ với câu chuyện này, rất reluctant đối để xử lý những vấn đề này, bởi vì là những cái lợi ích của từng nước cũng rất là khác nhau, không phối hợp được với nhau. Đấy. Ngay những nước liên quan trực tiếp thôi. Cho nên khi bản thân trong ASEAN ấy cũng chưa có cái sự quan tâm đầy đủ như chúng ta đã trao đổi ở đây. Đấy. Để mà xử lý những vấn đề này, và nếu không xử lý được thì cái sự phát triển của khu vực tiểu vùng Mekong nó sẽ có những cái khó khăn. Mà nó khó khăn rồi thì đương nhiên nó sẽ ảnh hưởng đến toàn bộ cái mục tiêu của chúng ta là xây dựng một cái cộng đồng phát triển như chúng ta mong muốn. Thế vậy đặt ra vấn đề ở đây ấy, thì tôi muốn bình luận thôi, có lẽ cũng không hỏi là một ấy, là ngay xử lý về lợi ích của các quốc gia liên quan cũng như của toàn bộ ASEAN, nó liên quan đến cái sự phát triển của một cái bộ phận rất quan trọng của cả khối ASEAN. Chúng ta xử lý như thế nào đây? Tôi rất chia sẻ ý kiến là có lẽ cũng phải nêu ra, và các nhà lãnh đạo cấp cao của ASEAN cũng phải bàn vấn đề này đưa vào trong chương trình nghị sự. Còn xử lý thế nào thì các cái đầu thông thái của trong ASEAN chúng ta sẽ từng bước xử lý. Nhưng cái thứ hai mà ngài đại sứ Bilahari nêu ra đây là nó đều liên quan đến cái vai trò của Trung Quốc. Các dòng sông đều liên quan, đều bắt nguồn từ Trung Quốc, và Trung Quốc xem chừng cũng rất là thờ ơ với cái mối quan tâm của các nước trong khu vực. Và khi có nhiều cơ chế hợp tác đề xuất ra hợp tác trong Mekong thì Trung Quốc đề ra một cái cơ chế khác. Đấy. Tôi nghĩ là như vậy. Lan thương Mekong cũng khá mạnh, cũng hấp dẫn. Đấy. Tôi nghĩ là có những cái phần nào đó mang tính chất là đối trọng với những cái mà các nước khác đang tính đến. Thế vậy ở đây nên chăng là ngay các nước trong tiểu vùng Mekong là chúng ta bên cạnh là phối hợp hài hòa các lợi ích của quốc gia với của cả khối, cả khu vực chúng ta, thì cái điều rất quan trọng là cũng có cái cách thức để chúng ta kéo các bạn Trung Quốc cùng tham gia vào quá trình này, bởi vì sự phát triển của khu vực này, của ASEAN nó cũng tác động tích cực đến sự phát triển Trung Quốc. Và nó thể hiện là Trung Quốc cũng coi khu vực là một cái đối tác quan trọng của Trung Quốc, chứ không phải chỉ là cái nơi là tranh giành ảnh hưởng giữa các nước lớn. Cái nữa tôi nghĩ rằng là chúng ta cũng không đặt vấn đề là các nước co cụm lại với nhau, phối hợp với nhau để mà chống Trung Quốc, mà cùng kéo Trung Quốc vào, dựa vào những cái văn bản đã có thể có của quốc tế, những kinh nghiệm quốc tế, nhưng đồng thời dựa vào ngay lợi ích của sự phát triển của tiểu khu vực. Từ đó chúng ta thấy rằng là cái lợi ích của các nước ở từng nước khu vực, của tiểu khu vực và kể cả của Trung Quốc, của các nước khác nữa, về cái chuyện xử lý vấn đề Mekong thì nó sẽ có nó đúng rồi. Cho nên tôi nghĩ ở đây khoan hãy nói chuyện về vai trò trung tâm của ASEAN trong cái cơ chế này. Tôi nghĩ là ASEAN phải quan tâm nhiều hơn, đầy đủ hơn đến xử lý những vấn đề, những thách thức của tiểu vùng Mekong, và rồi hãy bàn đến câu chuyện là vai trò trung tâm ở đây. Tôi xin có vài cái bình luận như vậy. Tôi xin cảm ơn.
Thank you, Ambassador Hung, for your comments. Certainly on how ASEAN will be playing its role in this region. The Mekong Sub-region will be very much important as we analyze it. But at the same time, part of the issues are how to bring the Mekong issue into ASEAN so that ASEAN can play. But from ASEAN Centrality, there's a responsibility for ASEAN to take care of the Mekong region as part of itself. So we talking in both ways. It's not paying too much attention to Mekong, so ASEAN Centrality will be affected, especially when challenges in one part of ASEAN still there, and we need to work together. And the other way is that geopolitics already there in the Mekong region. So both ways will be important to my mind. Your recommendation is that bring it to ASEAN for ASEAN notice and for ASEAN action, but at the same time, from ASEAN point of view, if we want to play central in the region, it has to pay attention to the sub-Mekong region, to the Mekong sub-region, as well as the maritime Southeast Asia. So the floor is open. We still have time for comments and questions.
Maybe I have a question if I can, Ambassador Lee.
Please, thank you, Dr. Lê Thu Hằng.
Yes, Ambassador Bilahari, I wanted to ask you a question about ASEAN being useful. You mentioned that in some respect, ASEAN was not very successful in socializing new members with the expansion. But also, I think it is also not a matter of new members, but new generations of leaders, of old members as well. I mentioned Thailand and the current domestic political instability within Thailand, making it perhaps paying less attention to ASEAN than Thailand used to. Similarly, we may argue that, for example, Indonesia, one of the original members, also plays a little bit less weight on ASEAN than it used to in the past, and some other older members as well. Singapore has been very constant in how much value it plays in ASEAN, but a newer member like Vietnam also has been quite constant in the way that it treats ASEAN. So in that respect, actually, it's quite successful of socializing Vietnam. So my question to you is, how do you think that successful socializing for the next generations of leaders within ASEAN to make them still value and see the usefulness of ASEAN, for them to place ASEAN at the central position and adhere to ASEAN centrality themselves?
So, Ambassador Kosi.
I think that's a good question. Look, when all members, I said the dirty secret about ASEAN is it originated as a Cold War organization, right? We denied it to the last breath, but that is the fact, right? That gave a certain coherence automatically, despite all the differences. Look, the differences were very great, among the original five. There was some talk whether Singapore, because we are so different, should be allowed to join in the first place. Singapore, when we are allowed to join, I told you we nearly didn't join because of the issue of foreign bases, which is a balance of power issue, right? Philippines had a huge claim over a serious claim. Now the claim is still there, not so seriously, over Sabah, right? But it was serious. In fact, Malaysia boycotted some of the early ASEAN meetings because Philippines insisted on raising this claim, right? And I can go on. There were so many, the aftermath. One of the big reasons for ASEAN, apart from the Cold War, don't forget, ASEAN was formed in the aftermath of an undeclared war that the Indonesians were waging against Malaysia, and then after we separated from Malaysia, against Malaysia and Singapore. It was an undeclared war, not a very high intensity war as was fought in Indochina, but it's still a war, right? And one of the purposes of ASEAN was to manage Indonesia, which is bigger than all of us combined, right? So, not stated, but it's there, right? The fundamental issue of ASEAN is to manage relations among its members, right? And I don't think Southeast Asia has come a long way from the 1960s, but we will never be in a position where we can say that we can take relations among members for granted. So you always need some mechanism. So that is the baseline. But is it enough? I don't think it is enough anymore. Now, when I mentioned that socialization, I said that my own personal view at that time, somewhere in the archive of Singapore Foreign Ministry, is we let Vietnam in first. For a very simple reason, two reasons. Vietnam was, after Indonesia and Thailand, the biggest country. But more important to my mind was, having worked with or against Vietnam for 10 years, I realized that Vietnamese had a strategic view of life. Naturally, I mean, given your history.
Accidentally.
No. If not, you will not. If not, we won't be sitting here. Okay? You did, all right. You have a natural strategic view of life, right? Mm-hmm. Now, it's not so important that I agree with your strategy or agree with my strategy. It's a way of thinking, right? A way of thinking which is very important. Now, I don't think that same way of thinking is present very deeply in, let's name names, Myanmar or Laos, right? It's not there. It certainly will not be there in East Timor. That's why I think it's quite disastrous for us to let them in, right? So, what could we have done? You may not know this, but you know why ASEAN expanded in a big bang like that? You know why? Because Dr. Mahathir insisted and no other leader wanted to argue with him. The rest of us are not so keen on having one big bang, right? But nobody wanted to argue with Dr. Mahathir. Sometimes it's as stupid, as simple as that, right? Because the leaders didn't feel, they were mistaken, I thought, that this was worth fighting over. Actually, it was worth fighting over because it fundamentally changed the character of ASEAN, right? I still think we should have let everybody in, but in a more staggered way, right? Vietnam first, and then maybe, with a more deliberate process. Not quite what the EU does, with the acquis communautaire, right? But actually you don't even abide by it within the EQ also. But at least we have a process, right? We should have had something similar but not quite so formalistic. What can we do now? Now I think the problem is different. I alluded to it and you also alluded to it in a different way. Now the problem is domestic politics. It's not just Thailand or Indonesia, Even in Singapore, it's different. I don't think ASEAN is understood in the same way by every Singapore leader either, because they come up through a different process. Leader, whether a bureaucratic leader or political leader, they come up through a different process. Singapore today is not the Singapore I grew up with. And that's good because it has to evolve. I mean, countries cannot stay the same, But the policy making has to evolve in tandem with the domestic politics of all countries. That is a reality. Domestic politics is always the main determinant of every country's foreign policy. That is a fact of life, right? So, how do we do it? I don't really have any good answer because we can't turn back the clock and become dictatorships all over again, Not desirable anyway, even if you could do it, right? I think we just have to keep. I am not unhopeful, okay? Vin was with me in that disastrous 2012 meeting in Cambodia, where we, for the first time, did not have a joint communique. But I can tell you, but I think we forget that within 1 week we had a communique because of Mati, right? And since then, while Cambodia has been troublesome, it has never been gone so far. Because I think they also realized they made a mistake and it was not in their own interest. The mistake was not made by Hun Sen or by the officials. I know the officials were very upset. It was made by one man.
In between.
In between. Okay, name him, Ho Nam Hong. Right? It's only him. Right? And on the Chinese side, there was a very ambitious woman, Fu Ying. Right? She was hoping that she could replace Yang Jie-tse. She was one of the names mentioned. I think it was a fantasy in her mind, but, right, but you know, anyway, she had that fantasy. So she was very pushy. But Cambodia never made that. They've been troublesome in other ways, but not in this particular way, because they realize also it is not in their own interest. So it's not impossible, you know. Right now, I don't think Cambodia is the major problem. The major problem is Laos. Right? Because, and I can't blame them. Laos doesn't have very much going for it. Who is going to invest in Laos on a large scale, if not China? Who? Nobody. That's the simple answer. Right? So I can't blame the Laos. And they have got not much to sell except hydroelectricity. Right? So I can't blame them. In fact, we in Singapore are thinking of buying some power from Laos ourselves. Right? So the best, I'm not pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic about the Mekong issue and about the socialization of the new members for a very simple reason. There is no better way to socialize them than events. Right? I already mentioned how Hun Sen has changed his mind about a couple of dams. Right? And I think, you know, the Lao have not yet quite woken up yet, but they will wake up sooner or later with a little bit of encouragement here and there, because it is existential for them. If the Mekong flow is so deeply interrupted, Laos is another country like Cambodia that its economy is largely subsistence agriculture. Can you imagine if the flow continues to be disrupted like that? Right? No, they will wake up one day. No, I mean, they're not silly people, they're not stupid. So the best socialization is events. Now, it may come slowly, more slowly than I would like or Vietnam would like, but it will come because events have a way of focusing your mind. Now, somebody, a great man said, Samuel Johnson, nothing focuses the mind better than the prospect of being hanged in the morning. Mm-hmm. Right? So, for the Mekong countries, the Mekong is an existential issue. It is the equivalent of being hanged. So they will wake up sooner or later. So we just have to encourage them to do it sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kosi Khan, for the comments. Actually, we've been discussing a lot about how ASEAN will behave. But we have the second part of that is the Mekong Sub-region, and Ambassador Don Xuân Hương just mentioned how to engage with China. There's a word of China everywhere, but we try not to tackle that one, engage. Actually, we have been engaging China a lot, proactively, and China is much more proactively engaged us in the Mekong Sub-region, but it's not in our way of expectations that what we want. So this is the thing, I think, that more than just the second forum, we need third, fourth, or several other forums to follow up. But certainly ASEAN need to act together, and the role of the riparian states in ASEAN will be very much important to raise the issue, to make it as a common concern of ASEAN. And second, we need not only China, but other dialogue partners. You mentioned about geopolitics and also balancing act. So this is very much important. I think we've exhausted our time. I give back the chairmanship to our DAV Ambassador Sun.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Vinh. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we've now come to the concluding session. My job was supposed to summarize the discussion, but I come to the conclusion the best way to summarize Ambassador Kosi Khan is not to summarize it at all and leave it to you for each and everyone to draw your own conclusions out of it. But I'm too humbled to actually conclude such a rich, in-depth and provocative discussion. I feel that we all have had brilliant 3 hours of discussion. I think we all come to the same feeling that ASEAN and all of us will need to regain the sense of realism, in the words of Ambassador Kosikan, challenge the conventional wisdom, challenge the conventional assumptions that we've been having, and rethink and re-equip ourselves with the skills and the instinct necessary in order to navigate a very different era in global politics and in regional geostrategic environment. So I think I'm going to leave you with that short note of concluding remarks, but I'd like to ask you to express our deep gratitude to Ambassador Bilahari Kosikan, to the excellent moderation of Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, and for the excellent participation of Dr. Le Thu Huong, as well as for your presence in this room today. Out of your busy schedule, I think all of your presence shows your support to the topic, to ASEAN Centrality, and also to what you think is a very important issue that matters to all of us in the Indo-Pacific. So thank all of you for your presence, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the 3rd and 4th and 5th Mekong Forum to dig deeper into other issues of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.